My name is Nicole Vaseleris, as mentioned before, and I'm with the National Marine Manufacturers Association. And I'll be joined today, who'll be doing the bulk of our presenting, by Kristen Maury with the law firm Maury and Grimson, our trade counsel in this aluminum sheet case. Next slide. So I wanted to give everybody a little bit of background on where we are today and why this is such a critical next step. Back in November, the Department of Commerce self-initiated an anti-dumping and countervailing duty case on Chinese aluminum sheet. Now, this is the first time in nearly 3 decades that such a self-initiation had occurred. Aluminum sheet is a common raw material not only used in boat manufacturing, but obviously in RV as well as trailer manufacturing as well. And so that's why those of you joining us on today's call representing the broad sweep of industries that are being impacted by this Department of Commerce investigation and the ITC case on common alloy sheet. We've engaged with trade counsel Kristen and her partner Jeff to represent our industry interests. And in the past few months, as we watched this case go forward, we probably couldn't have anticipated back in November the breadth of trade issues that would be going on today. But this is really going to be focused on, in the past few months, the Department of Commerce putting a 120% tariff on common alloy sheet from China. This does not include all the other aluminum and steel tariffs that are going on, but this is directed towards sheet aluminum coming from China. Now, ITC has a final say, really, this fall in the current tariff. And so this is really our only chance to hopefully overturn this tariff, provide some, alleviate some of the increased prices that we know that many have seen, and some of the issues that we've seen as a result of this case. This is a very critical phase, and so I really appreciate everybody joining us today. Next slide. And what we're going to do is be able to give you a little bit of an overview. We want to make sure that everybody understands what the ITC is, the importance of these purchaser and importer questionnaires. Many of you have hopefully already received them. It's really important that everybody understands not only the importance, but you're able to answer these questionnaires, participate in them. It helps to really build the case in front of the ITC and our final hearing this fall to try and overturn the 120% tariff. I want to make sure that you have the opportunity, if you already haven't, to meet Kristen, to introduce you to our legal counsel. You know, this is really just an opportunity to give you a snapshot, but we are happy to follow up, answer any specific questions to your company and your industry needs. Now, we can't give any legal advice. We're not going to be answering any specific company facts and figures, but really just want to use this opportunity to give you a baseline of what the questionnaire is, encourage you all to answer it, and then provide an opportunity. We'll have our contact information at the end to answer any follow-up questions. So with that, I want to turn it over to Kristen to get us started.
Thanks so much, Nicole. We will go to the next slide, which I think we've mostly covered. But again, as Nicole said, this case was self-initiated, and we're, just as a reminder, there are 2 separate agencies that conduct these investigations. So today's focus is obviously on the ITC, and they are the agency that just determines whether or not there's injury to the domestic producing industry. But where you see the actual countervailing duty and anti-dumping duty rates that have been announced, those are calculated by the Department of Commerce. So what we are focusing on today is not how high or how low the rates are going to be, but what the ITC process is in looking at injury. So next slide, please. Okay, the International Trade Commission is a quasi-judicial commission. There are typically 6 commissioners. It is intended that they are no more than 3 from any particular party. So, you know, historically you would have 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, but there's some fudging with that right now. But in any event, there are only 5 confirmed commissioners. And the reason that that's important for us right now is that each commissioner has a vote, and If there is a tie, then the tie goes to the domestic industry. So if we were at full strength, 6 commissioners, or if we were just at 4, which we were for much of last year, then the tie vote, would go to the petitioners, and the case would go forward. Which means that if there were 6 commissioners, we would need 4 votes to win, but the petitioners would only need 3 votes to win. But since we're at 5, then each of us only needs 3 votes to win. So it lessens the burden on the respondents just by reason of the numbers. So what the ITC does is they consider whether or not there's injury to the domestic producers, and is that injury is caused by the subject imports. So we typically look at, we look at it in a bifurcated way. If we can prove based on the domestic industry's financial performance, employment, all of that, that there is no injury, then we don't even have to get to the second step. But usually if they've brought this case, they have a pretty good body of evidence to prove that they are suffering harm. And so we then focus on that second part, is the injury caused by the subject imports. At the end, there will be this up or down vote. Like I said, it's either injury or no injury. They also have a separate vote on whether or not there's threat of future injury. But if the vote is negative, then the whole case goes away. And that's really our goal, here. That's why we've joined the forces of all of you guys together, and why we're trying to get as full a body of evidence before the commission so that they can make the right decision given their statutory requirements. If the vote is affirmative and they find that there is injury caused by Chinese imports, then the case goes to what's called an order, and you will see both the anti-dumping and the countervailing duty rates finalized and the order put in place. There's, one of the reasons that we're pushing so hard for this, obviously, is to win now, because once an order is in place, it can stay in place for a very long time. And I actually just looked at this the other day. The longest standing anti-dumping order was put in place in 1977 against high pressure tape from Italy or something like that. So these cases can stay around a long time. The rates will go up and down each year, but the fact that there is protection in place on these imports has a really lasting impact, and that's why we're trying to push so hard to nip it in the bud. At the preliminary, we did have a unanimous vote of injury, but that is very common. It's very, very rare to win a case at the preliminary, but one of the reasons we got involved so early on is to lay the groundwork for this phase, the final phase, and so that is what we're doing now. Okay, next slide. What we're here to talk about primarily today is the U.S. Purchasers Questionnaire. It looks like this. That's the first page. If you did get one of these sent to you by the ITC, then you will have to respond to it. If you haven't gotten one, you certainly can download it, and I think Nicole has been making them available. And we do encourage, broad participation in these. So the next slide. If any of you have your Purchasers Questionnaire in front of you, what they're doing is the ITC is gathering information from buyers about why they buy from a particular source. And as I said, if you received the questionnaire from the ITC directly, you are required to answer it. They do have subpoena authority, the ITC. They don't regularly use it, but they will follow up with you if they sent you a questionnaire and you did not respond. Okay, next slide. The questionnaire responses are due on August 31st. If you remember nothing else from today, please do not turn in the questionnaire response without having it vetted through counsel. So we are here to review every one of your responses and answer any questions that you have, but please don't just submit it directly, because a lot of times we will be able to issue spot and see where we know the commission will ask for more clarification, and we'll just kind of, get that taken care of before it goes in the first instance. So we are here to help for the remainder of the month for any and all of you. It is possible to get an extension. I know it's a tough time of year. A lot of people are on vacation, and you might not have the appropriate personnel in place. You can get an extension. Normally, they'll only give you a couple of extra days. As you go through the questionnaire, we highly recommend that you designate one person as the point person that will coordinate all of the gathering of different information from what they need. So you'll need, for sure, accounting, purchasing, quality control, logistics, and kind of what we would call, product experts, people that know why you're choosing a particular alloy or particular source or anything for each individual application. And then finally, this question of who sees my answers, and this is important for companies to know. The whole reason the ITC can do this process is because they rely on the factual, very sensitive, confidential information from all of these companies. And the only way that they can get companies to agree to provide all this information is to assure them that the confidentiality will be maintained. So we have what's called an Administrative Protective Order, an APO, and that means that the agency people within the ITC can look at your data. They cannot share it with any other government agency. They are prohibited by law from sharing it with any other government agency. And then the lawyers in the case will be able to review everybody's data, but we are bound by this Administrative Protective Order, and we, obviously we cannot divulge any confidential information that we see, but we're able to aggregate and, draw conclusions from what everyone has said about the state of the industry, and that's how we make our arguments. So when you see going forward, after all the questionnaires are put in and we will be drafting the legal briefs, we will only be able to share with you guys the public versions of our legal briefs. And that can be frustrating. I just want to make sure that you all understand that from the beginning. That can definitely be frustrating because you'll be looking at a 85-page document and there's a lot of blank space in there, and that's really just because we are not at liberty to disclose any of the confidential information that we've analyzed. But you can rest assured that we are doing everything we can and fighting the good fight for you all, and also rest assured that your confidential information is being treated the same way by all the other parties here. So none of the domestic mills, this is really what I'm getting at, none of the domestic mills will be able to see your information. Okay, next slide. As you're going through the questionnaire, this is the type of information in the purchaser's questionnaire that the ITC is looking for. Obviously, the quantity of purchases by type and by source. And if you, in the very beginning of the questionnaires themselves, they have what we call the scope of the case, so the product definition of the common alloy aluminum sheet that is subject to the case. That's on page 2 of the questionnaires, and that's where you'll have all of your definitions of what do I need to report here. If you have direct imports, we'll talk about the importer's questionnaire in a minute, but they will also ask about imports, and they ask for sure about end uses. From my discussions with many of the members, you may not know the source, the country of origin of the product when you're buying it, if you're buying it from a distributor. So if, as you're filling that out, you may have to put in unknown, whether it's, it's domestic purchase, but unknown the origin of the product. And we're happy to walk you through and help you deal with those questions as you're going through. They also ask about demand changes. They ask about demand changes for your end product. And whether or not that's affected your purchasing decisions. They ask about quality differences, and they really want to know if I'm looking at, with the same specs, if I'm looking at sheet from the U.S. or from China, what are the differences? Are there any differences, and what drives you to choose one over the other, if there is something that drives you to choose that? And then another they do want to know for sure any non-price factors that influence that decision. And from many of my conversations with you all, there's definitely some supply constraints that we've been hearing about, that you're just not able to get things domestically. But each company should just answer the questions based on their own experience. And then a really important, there's two specific products that they're looking at. One that is currently in the case that the companies are trying to get evaluated separately, and that's brazing stock. So if you have information about brazing stock, you'll see the questions in there. And then the other one that's really important for us is can stock, and that is currently excluded from the case. So import duties do not apply to imports on can stock. But one of the things that we're trying to explore is whether or not the domestic can stock production should be taken into account when looking at the overall health of the company. So if you have, I know you guys are not using can stock for the most part, but if you have anyone within your organization that has prior experience working with can stock, from a former job or any other, for any other experience working with can stock, we would love to have some one-on-one conversations. So please keep that in mind as you're going through. And then finally, we realize that this is a multi-front trade war that we're on, that there's a lot of different battles going on, and that everyone is also impacted by the 232 case. And we need to develop the facts as relates to the 232 case that helps us as best as possible in this case. Next slide. Okay. The most important thing, and this is a relic of I don't know from where or when, but the most important thing to remember when you're filling this out is that the ITC requires the units to be in short tons. Nobody keeps their records that way. We recognize that it is, not reflective of how anything is done, but that is how they keep, that's how they collect the data. So please make sure that your units are appropriately converted. This is here just a distinction between purchases and imports. A purchase is from another company in the U.S., even if it is an imported product. It's just that you're buying it from a domestic distributor. And imports is where you are the importer of record directly. Next slide. Okay. Here is where you all, and obviously it will, vary based on industry, but this is where you all talk about what percentage of the products that you produce, what percentage of the cost of the materials is made up of this sheet. And then you put all your other inputs together as well. And this is only, this does include labor, energy, and other raw materials. So it's not just raw material inputs, but it does include labor and energy as well. So what I am anticipating is that because of the difference in prices from 6 months ago, that this number will be different today than it was at the end of 2017. And what we've looked at this question carefully. We've consulted with the ITC on this, and what we are advising at this point is that this should be your current cost share. So if you can have a good judge of what that difference is from, let's say, December of 2017 to now, let's talk about that individually offline. But for right now, this should be the current cost percentage of sheet for your total product. I leave it to you all if you want to kind of aggregate the different types of products. They ask for 3 there, so if you want to, if there's separate classes that you can talk about, I would start with your obviously start with your number 1 product and give the cost percentage that way. Okay, next slide, please. All right, this question on demand is, again, read the questions carefully, but this question A is, has the demand for your products incorporating sheet changed since 2015, since January 1, 2015. And I know from, conversations with some of you that there have been, great increase in demand and great growth in the various industries from 2015 through 2017, and then things kind of have dropped off. But I would, again, we can talk about these individually as you wish, but this is overall, has the demand increased since 2015? And then the follow-up question is, has that had any effect on your demand for sheet? Obviously, you're all here because sheet is an important product in your production, and so I would think that would follow on. Next slide. Here is a section that we are really going to want to spend a lot of time on, and that is the availability of supply and supply constraints. And you'll see that there's a little box at the far right that says explain or further describe. If there's anything that you want to say in response to these questions that doesn't fit within the box, you can always just say see, attachment or see response. So there's a kind of a catch-all question at the end, and put it in a separate document or at the end of the document with your further explanation for this question. But here we're particularly interested in hearing from you if you've sought to source from a domestic mill and have been denied, if you have any evidence of mills saying we cannot supply you or we're not even going to take your order or anything, any emails or letters, anything like that, we'd love to see it. And if you have experience with any shortages to a specific type or specific width. So any kind of details you have where I've heard from many companies, like, our first preference is always to buy American. That's what we want to do just because that's what, we feel is important. But we've tried and we've been unable to because X, Y, or Z. And that's a story that we want to hear a lot more about, rather more than just what you're going to put in these boxes. So if you have a story to tell on that, I think we'll want to talk with you guys individually about your experience. Next slide. This will definitely vary by company, but it's really just what are the factors influencing your purchasing decisions. This starts on page 14, and it's really a hierarchy. Do you first look at the specs? Do you first look at the price? Do you first look at the reliability of the supplier? Whatever the factors are that influence your decision, that's going to be important to highlight there. Next slide. Here is a little bit of a tricky question, and I'd like you to make sure you read this carefully, and that is, if it's a question of, did your firm purchase imports of sheet from China instead of U.S. produced China? And they're really saying, I used to buy X number of tons from the U.S., and then I stopped buying that, and instead I went to China to buy that same amount of tons or more, or a portion, whatever it is. So if you were actually replacing U.S. shipments, U.S. purchases with imported purchases from China, then go ahead and answer that. And if the answer is that you did, the second question is, was it based on price or was it based on some other factor? So this one is definitely one to be careful with. Next slide. I will say, as a general proposition, the underlying theory of any dumping case by the petitioners, or in this case by the domestic industry, is the argument that we are losing, and we're losing because of price. We're losing because they're taking greater market share and they're always priced lower than we are. And that's the only reason that we're losing. And so one thing that we really like to identify is there a factor other than price that would cause this shift? Sometimes I don't get the sense that this is the case in this industry, but Sometimes there's a particular product innovation that the Chinese are doing better than the U.S., and that slight shift. Sometimes it's in the more consumer type items, there's been a fashion trend or a shift because of some other external forces where the product is actually really different and it doesn't have to do with price. So here, you just want to think about whether or not there are any non-price factors that influence your decision making. Next slide. Again, here, I referred to this earlier. They're examining separately the Brazing stock and the can stock segments. And again, the Brazing stock is currently included in the case, so subject to the duties, and then the producers of Brazing stock are trying to say, we're such a different animal, we're such a different product that you should do the injury analysis separately for Brazing stock than for the rest of the continuum of products. And on the flip side of that, can stock is excluded from the case, and because of that, the petitioners are saying, the domestic industry is saying, because they're excluded, you should not look at the domestic performance, the domestic industry's performance of can stock. And we've already, in the prelim, have already made the argument that absolutely you should look at the domestic producer's performance in can stock, and that should be part of the overall injury analysis of the entire domestic industry. And we talk a lot about a continuum of products. And so while can stock may have a different end use, it's not like it's a completely separate industry. And so, again, if you have anyone that has experience with can stock, we'd love to hear from them. And if you have no experience with these, you can just write like not applicable or no knowledge. If this is just in any of these cases, if they're asking you a question where you all don't have experience with it, by all means, just put that in rather than trying to guess. Okay, next slide. So I talked a little bit about the 232 case, and what the ITC is trying to do is to examine this injury case in a vacuum almost. They want to separate out what's happening because of 232 with what's happening because of what they're viewing as unfairly traded imports over the last 3 years. So you should definitely answer these questions, but you should know that separately we are also gathering as much information as we can about the impact of 232, and even if it is not put in the four corners of this questionnaire, we are going to try to put together the strongest set of factors that is also influencing the overall market that is separate from the AD/CVD case. The next slide is just if any of your members have applied for a 232 exclusion request, or if you guys or your distributors, please let us know about that right away. We would like to be tracking those requests. We'd like to be tracking whether any of the domestic mills comment on, object to, or otherwise, influence that 232 decision. So we would like to have that information if you could send it to us. And then if you have received any written communications from any of the mills, or if your distributors have received anything that talk about the 232 case, regardless of what it says, if there's anything out there that those mills are shopping around that mentions 232, we would like to see it. We're gathering as much evidence as we can of what these companies are doing in the actual marketplace, and if they are doing something different in front of the ITC, we want to be able to contrast that and say, look, they're telling you that this is the situation, but when they're out, last April or wherever talking to their customers, this is what they were saying. And so it's just a fact check. I know that doesn't happen too often these days, but a fact check on what they are explaining. Okay, next slide. This is your kind of catch-all. I mentioned it earlier. If you have more to say than fits in one of the boxes on any of the prior questions, you can put that in there. You're also able to put in whole separate, letters, documents, addenda, anything that you want to add to this questionnaire, you can. So, okay, the next couple slides we're going to go through pretty quickly because a lot of them are, a lot of the information is the same, but in case there are any companies out there that also had direct imports from any source, then you should also be filling out the importer's questionnaire, which is a separate document. You'll remember that there are 4 separate questionnaires here: the foreign producers, obviously, the U.S. producers, the U.S. importers, and the U.S. purchasers. So if you had any direct imports during from January 1, 2015 onward, then you should answer the importer's questionnaire. And these slides are the same as what the first ones. You can flip through this and the next one. They're just the same as what we talked about in the, that's good, in the purchaser's questionnaire. I will say this, the importer's questionnaire is a lot more detailed, a lot longer, and they ask for a lot of information. So I know it's a horrible endeavor, but it is really important. We are trying to give the ITC as complete a record as possible. So if you did have any direct imports, it's really important that you fill that out. Some things to remember is in the imports, they do need you to reconcile your beginning and ending inventory. You'll see when you're filling out the questionnaire that if it doesn't go to 0, a little alert will come up. They do ask for details on the thickness and width, and the most important thing is that they ask for quarterly pricing data for 8 specific products. These are what we call the pricing products, and these products are, largely driven by the domestic industry saying this is what we want you to examine. But what we're trying to do there, what the ITC is trying to do is they collect that quarterly data and they're looking at whether or not the imported product is in fact underselling the domestically produced product. So this pricing data is really important, and sometimes it's there's no right or wrong answer. The accurate answer is the right answer here. So there's no gaming the system here. Sometimes it's underselling across the board. Sometimes it's a mixed bag. Sometimes the Chinese product is so far underselling the domestic product that there's no market principles at work there, and there's no reason why anyone would continue to buy the domestic product at that higher price. So they must be in different product categories. They might just be different products for different markets. So just for that one, definitely, do the most accurate pricing information that you can. Okay, import of record. The next slide. Once the ITC gets all of this information, they compile, like I said, the data from the 4 different questionnaires. They develop a picture of the whole industry as it was in the beginning of 2015, how it performed throughout, and how it is now and looking forward. They will look at the percentage of market share in the U.S. that China makes up and whether or not that has increased over time. They'll look at third country producers. Obviously, Canada is a very big player in this market as well, in this segment. So they'll look at what has been happening, what shifts have happened over this 3-year period. For the domestic producers, they look, as I mentioned before, their overall financial health. They'll look at their sales volumes, their workers employed, any changes that have happened over the 3-year period. They will look at whether or not there have been any plant shutdowns, and importantly, in this context, whether or not they have restarted any mills since the beginning of this case. And they've been very specific about, don't give me, we plan to restart, like only tell me when you have actually made the investment or board approval or a specific time frame to open up a new mill or line. I mentioned the underselling for those pricing products. They'll look and see whether or not there is underselling. And their overall question is, are these subject imports, so the imports just from China, are they significant? are they causing or threatening to cause material injury to the domestic industry? So that's what the ITC is doing with all of this, and what we're doing when we get all of these questionnaire responses is doing the same thing, looking at what everyone has replied to the questionnaires and trying to put together the picture that makes the most sense. Obviously we're focused. We usually come in with the assumption that they're going to be able to show some kind of injury, so we focus mostly on the causation factor, but we will see what the data show when they all come in. Okay, so the next slide is really just kind of our path forward. The deadline's coming up. Now through the end of the month is when you will all be working on your questionnaire responses. Many of you may have separate counsel, which is perfectly fine. Consult with them. If you don't and you want to consult with us, that's what we're here for. But I do, as I said in the beginning, I do recommend please have someone review it before it gets filed. On October 16th, the ITC will issue a report and give their compilation. I should have mentioned this from the beginning, and I apologize. We have also engaged a team of economists from a firm called Economic Consulting Services. They specialize in just these trade cases, and they are the top of their field and just really excellent economists, and we've already engaged them. They are going to be working with us, and they're going to be doing the same analysis that the ITC will be doing. So when we get all these questionnaires, they will be compiling all of the data, aggregating it, looking for trends, looking for things that don't make sense, often suggesting to the ITC some follow-up questions that they ask of the domestic producers, and so forth. On the 23rd, we will file our pre-hearing brief based on all of this data. Again, when we send it to you all, we're only going to be able to send you the public version, so I just ask for your patience in advance. Please don't be frustrated by the fact that there's a lot that's blanked out. We're fighting the good fight here, and we're complying with what our obligations are. The hearing is scheduled for October 30th. It's an all-day hearing at the ITC, and I know I've talked to a couple people that are interested in being witnesses. A lot of times what we are looking for in a witness is someone either that is currently buying both domestic and Chinese and can speak to the differences of why they use one over the other, or we're looking for someone that has been repeatedly denied access to the domestic mills. And then as we see each of your questionnaire responses, there may be things in there that prompt us to want to reach out to you again and say, hey, this is a really interesting story, something we hadn't thought about before. Would you be willing to come and be a witness? I will say oftentimes when companies are purchasing from both domestic and imported sources, and they are afraid of jeopardizing their relationship with their domestic mills by coming forward in the case, there is also the opportunity to do a confidential affidavit. So that, again, is something that only the lawyers would see and the ITC staff, but the mills would never see. So if you're in the position where you really have something to say, but you don't want to be a witness, then we can work with you to develop a confidential affidavit that lays out whatever facts you can attest to and what your experience is, and we can submit that along with our briefs. After the hearing, we have another round of briefs. They're due November 8th, and then we have a final, much shorter, but a final legal brief document that goes in on the 30th of November. And then the ITC votes on December the 5th. They will vote whether or not there's injury. We go to the vote. We look them in the eye, and they've obviously they've decided beforehand what they want to do, but that is when we will know whether all the refunds from the duties that have been posted so far are coming back, or whether we have to strap ourselves in for a 20-plus year management of this case. Okay, the next slide. So what you can do, obviously the number one thing is to do these questionnaires. We are here to help throughout. You can, with each of your associations, support them and whatever information they're asking of you, for their PR and other government relations campaigns. please work with them. We definitely do encourage Hill engagement, and I know each of your associations has a point person to handle that, but this is this is a great story. This is a story of that these tariffs are killing American manufacturing and really good high-paying manufacturing jobs and in companies that are contributing to their communities, not just with the direct employment, but with all of the ripple effect employment that these jobs provide. And this is not, a classic, oh, my Hill representative isn't going to want to engage on this because they're not going to want to be seen as soft on China. This is classic, if we are trying to, protect American manufacturing or protect our way of life, then we need to stop these tariffs from going into effect. And part of that message, too, is just even if you're not using a single sheet of Chinese aluminum sheet, if you've never bought a single ton, you know that these tariffs being in place have emboldened the domestic mills to jack their prices up. So even if someone is not using the imported product, the impact on the consuming industry is dramatic and is real, and that is another great story to be able to tell. So that is it for me. The next slide has my contact information on it, and I know that each of the associations also has that. So if you forget it or lose it, you can go through them to get in contact with us. Nicole, I don't know if you had any further follow-up or if any questions came through the portal that we need to address.
Yeah, so just a couple follow-up questions or follow-up statements. One, if you have received a questionnaire, I think it's the big takeaway is make sure you fill it out before you submit it. Make sure you've had counsel review it. This is a member benefit not only from NMMA but RVIA and NATM, and so please use Kristen and her team as you're filling out this questionnaire. If you haven't received a questionnaire but you use aluminum sheet, you can still fill out the questionnaire, and it's actually really important to help build the overall case. Logistically, we will be sending both a recording as well as these slides. So if you have anybody else in your company that you want to make sure is looped into some of the information shared today, we will be able to give you that. You have Kristen's information here, but please, as she mentioned, don't hesitate to reach out to me. We'll also make sure that you have your contacts if you're with the RV Industry Association or NATM, that you can reach out to their government relations staff as well. If you have any questions, the way we're going to handle this is please make sure to type in your question in the box provided with the GoToWebinar. We will compile all those questions and either do a Q&A for things that maybe some of you have asked, or expect Kristen to reach out individually to help answer some of those specific questions. And with that, I think we will wrap up, unless you have anything else to add, Kristen.
No, just thank you all for your patience and listening. And I know, we obviously deal with these trade cases all the time, and we know that they are an extraordinary burden on companies that are just, trying to run their actual business. And it takes a lot of resources away from the actual day-to-day goals that you have and responsibilities that you have, but it is super important, and we're here to help. So I feel your pain. I'm sorry that you're going through it, but it's worth the fight.